Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israelis experiencing a night of true terror as violent riots and Hamas rockets reach the hearts of major cities. Meanwhile, popular U.S. politicians and celebrities speaking out supporting the Palestinian cause, asking Israel to show restraint while excusing Hamas's indiscriminate terror. And all while Israel working to feverishly dial back the unrest. The second civilian vehicle targeted by Hamas's anti-tank missiles, leaving 2 more Israelis near Gaza seriously injured and 1 more dead. The barrage from the Strip continuing all night long and showing little signs of slowing. Viewer discretion is advised.
תירגע, אני פה.
Israeli civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly, spending Tuesday night and Wednesday morning in bomb shelters and stairwells. Rocket sirens continuing to blare across central and southern Israel as terror groups Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launching salvo after salvo to overcome the Iron Dome defense system's limits. And they're targeting indiscriminately towards Israel's population centers. Roughly 1,100 rockets and counting fired from the Strip in little over 48 hours. Israel, for its part, responding with heavy airstrikes, targeting terror group infrastructure and command units. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz both promising to punish those responsible.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו בעיצומה של מערכה כבדה, מבצע שומר החומות. צה"ל תקף אתמול והיום מאות מטרות טרור של החמאס והג'יהאד האסלאמי ברצועת עזה. חמאס והג'יהאד האסלאמי שילמו, ואני אומר לכם כאן, ישלמו מחיר כבד מאוד על התוקפנות שלהם. אני אומר כאן הערב, דמם בראשם.
צה"ל פועל ב-24 שעות האחרונות ביחד עם השב"כ לצידה של המשטרה, ועושה זאת באופן עוצמתי ובמאות תקיפות. מפעלי ייצור, מנהרות, מגדלים שמשמשים את ראשי הארגונים מתפוררים ברחבי עזה וימשיכו להתפורר. יש המון מטרות בקנה.
At least 43 in Gaza reported killed by the Hamas Health Ministry. The IDF claiming that most are terror group commanders and fighters, while some are civilian casualties primarily due to Hamas's own rockets falling back in the Strip. Still, Hamas's rocket fire slowed, but not over. Sirens still sounding in the southern border regions. Israel police working with IDF forces to restore calm and provide aid in affected areas.
We've had more than 300 rockets that have landed inside the cities, inside the populated areas. And unfortunately, until now, if we look at the numbers and the people that have been injured and killed, we've had 5 Israelis who were killed in the different sites as a result of those rockets from the Hamas being fired directly into the different cities.
The death toll, meanwhile, in Israel as of this morning updated to 6. 1 Israeli killed and another 2 seriously wounded by a Hamas anti-tank missile targeting their Jeep Wednesday morning. Another death last night in Rishon LeZion, just south of Tel Aviv, a 50-year-old woman hit directly during a huge missile barrage targeting central Israel. Likewise, in Lod, a father and his 16-year-old daughter killed by a rocket that directly struck their home. 2 women in Ashkelon as well, an elderly woman and her 32-year-old caregiver from India also killed, and 3 more civilians injured, including a 5-year-old girl in Holon, when an empty bus was struck then burst into flames. These just some of the many injuries across the country due to shrapnel, shock, and rushing to nearby shelters. Therefore, areas from the Negev Desert and Gaza border region all the way up to Netanya along the coast and Jerusalem to the east turned orange by the IDF Homefront Command. All citizens in these areas asked to keep crowds to a minimum and to stay as close to a shelter as possible. Additionally, Israeli civilians are ordered to steer clear of the Gaza border, where vehicles are targeted in particular, and where IDF officials say Gaza militants may breach the security barrier completely. Meanwhile, as rockets rain, major cities with mixed Jewish and Arab Israeli or Arab Palestinian populations become unrecognizable, descending into vile lynch mobs and major clashes between one another and with police.
At the same time, as we've been dealing with the rockets that have been landing, we're also preventing terrorist attacks from taking place, both inside Jerusalem as well as in the area of Judea and Samaria towards the end of the Ramadan festival. The last 24 to 48 hours, Israeli National Police units have been mobilized also in different areas to deal with large-scale riots that have taken place by thousands of Israeli Arabs from the north, from the area of Accra, the city in the north, as well as in the central district, Wadi Ara, Ramle, Lod, and all the way down south to the area of Rahat, south of Beersheba, where we've made over 150 arrests of suspects who have targeted Israelis, burnt vehicles, burnt synagogues, and have tried and attempted to kill our police officers.
Additionally, for the first time in Israel's history, Lod, being in particular distress, completely shut down to all going both in and out of the city, and a regiment of border police units ordered to Lod and elsewhere overnight. Several incidents across the country, but especially in Lod, including shootings, stabbings, stonings, petrol bombs, lynch mobs, pulling people out of cars, and more. Most targeting Jewish civilians and security personnel, but some Jewish Israeli groups stoking the fires as well, at times defending themselves justifiably, while at other times seen forming lynch mobs of their own and attacking Arabs. Most Israeli authorities demanding calm. And we too absolutely reject and condemn all nationalistic, religious, and ethnically based violence against Jews and Arabs alike. Meantime, joining me now with insights into the security situation at hand, former Prime Minister, media advisor, and former IDF senior intelligence officer, Colonel Reserves Miri Eisen, and fighter pilot and former head of Israel Air Force Intelligence, Brigadier General Reserves, Ram Shmueli. Ram, Miri, thank you both so much for being with us. Miri, I'll start with you. What can you tell us about that we may not already know with respect to Israel's recent efforts to restore calm?
The biggest challenge right now is what I call the blinking mode. Israel needs to show that we are the ones who are ruling, that we are sovereign, that Hamas is not the one calling the shots. Over the last 48 hours, it's already closing in on 72. Hamas is trying to change the rules of the game, which sounds terrible, but there are rules of the game in that very testy relationship between Israel and the Hamas-ruled Gaza Strip. Over the last 48 hours, the Israeli Defense Forces are trying to define and show both our capabilities. Let me give you one idea of that difference. When we want to take out a top terror activist, then we both phone the house, tell them to leave. Before we attack any of these top buildings that have been attacked in the Gaza Strip, and we will continue to do so. They will not be the ones to define how they fire, where they fire, ruling in that sense, changing these rules of the game.
So how much more can we expect with respect to the Gaza rocket fire and the violence that has erupted from the south?
I think we all need to breathe deep. This could go on for quite a long while. It depends on both sides. Israel will make sure that we have both the superiority over the Hamas, over these terror operatives, over their firing indiscriminately, endlessly into all of the state of Israel. You've seen the pictures from before. Together with that, Hamas is not just going to back down. They've been building up these capabilities for years. And at this stage along the way, it's a question of making sure that terror armies like Hamas are not the ones who run the rules. So I say breathe deep. I don't think it will be over soon, but I'm not really sure how long this could actually go on for.
All right, Ram, I want to bring you into the conversation now. Just now I spoke with Miri about the targeted airstrikes and the degree to which, the lengths at which Israel goes to avoid casualties, unintended casualties. So when we say targeted airstrikes, how targeted are we talking about? Because we've heard, again, of unnecessary casualties from international media.
Let's start with the 3.5 million Israelis that have to be in shelters, million students that don't go to school. This is unacceptable. In order to make sure that this kind of attack that came only by their initiative to attack the Israeli civilians. They don't have any military targets. They aim to kill Israel civilians. We started an aerial campaign. That this aerial campaign is unique and different from the former one. First of all, usually they used to know that if they are in the underground, in the tunnels, nobody will touch them. Surprise, we attack tunnels. We attack those commanders in the tunnels, and there is no safe place in Gaza. There is no safe place for your family house. There is no safe place for the headquarters. And of course, as Miri said, we, unlike the Hamas, we don't attack civilian as a target. We attack terrorists, those terrorists that decided to shoot all over the southern part of Israel, the central part of Israel, and threaten our well-being.
Again, though, we're hearing certain calls, especially from the international community, for Israel to try and limit or contain or even reduce our supposedly disproportionate response. How do you respond to the argument of disproportionality?
I remember 2006, like Miri said, I was the head of the intelligence of the Air Force. And I remember the leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who said after the war, during the war, he tried to fake a kind of winning picture of how he ends the war. But as a respective of the past, he said that if he would have known that we are going to attack such like this, he might think twice. He might think twice whether to attack and start this war. The same thing will go for Hamas. The next time that they will consider attack Jerusalem, or they will consider attack the civilians, they will take a second thought. So we are going to reshape the deterrence. We are going to reshape the rule of engagement, and we are going to protect our citizens, both from the outside threat, and I'm telling you also from the inside threat, since I'm in the New Guardian in HaShomer HaChadash, I know that we have to be very straightforward about any kind of riots inside Israel. It's unacceptable, and we are not going to tolerate this kind of things.
Okay, well, so more on that now. I want to move on to discuss the terrifying and shockingly heinous events unfolding in the city of Lod and other major cities. Again, I'm joined by Colonel Reserves Miri Eisen and Brigadier General Reserves Ram Shmueli. Miri, I'll bring you back. We've never seen incidents like this in Lod, or at least not for many, many years. What did Israel maybe do wrong? What did Israel do right? What does it take to restore calm?
So to restore calm, you need to have people uphold the law. We know this worldwide in democracies. When people are breaking the law, you need to bring in forces to uphold the law. But for a moment, I want everybody to breathe deep, because what came out and is coming out and continues to come out in the Arab population of Israel, for me as an Israeli, for somebody who's been involved in these issues for so many years, it's the first time I'm seeing in many years a young voice, what I am going to call young angry men, who are coming out in droves against Israeli sovereignty, against the rule of law. And when you ask about that, why did it happen? The lack of rule of law, strict law inside Arab populations in Israel has been an ongoing challenge for years now. That is not something new. One of the reasons we saw stronger participation of the Arab citizens in our last with 3 out of the 4 elections as it grew was the idea that Israel would become more involved. They have an enormous amount of murders there, much higher than in other portions of the population. And these young, angry men coming out in the month of Ramadan with a cry of Al-Aqsa, Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, are bringing out a sentiment which I see both in the Gaza Strip, throughout the Middle Eastern world, people who feel that they are not part of the country they're in. And I say this sadly, they don't feel part of Israel. They feel they don't have a good enough future, even though we need to remember this isn't necessarily presenting all of the 20% of Israeli citizens who live in Israel. We're looking at young, angry men rioting in very specific places. And I don't want to be inclusive about all of them. There's definitely a challenge both of education and of unemployment, but overwhelmingly of self-identity.
So, Ram, you also just a minute ago spoke about your history dealing with Israel-Arab relations and security within Israel. So, coming with that and off of what Colonel Eisen just said, how widespread is anti-Israel belief in the Arab-Israeli community? How much are we, as the media, maybe blowing this out of proportion? Because, of course, as Miri said, again, many Arab and Muslim Israelis reject the recent violence as well.
First of all, I expect the leaders to get against those kind of young people. As Miri said, I don't say young people, I said people who are got a backup from their leaders. I didn't hear yet any leader who said to stop the violence inside Israel. If you want to be a citizen of Israel, and if you want to have the passport of Israel, you have to obey the law, both inside the villages and, of course, against Jews, because this is the only Jewish state that we have. So as long as the leaders silent, and as long as the Qadi in the mosque feed the fire, we have to be very cautious. We have to be very cautious. I call the people of Israel to be very strong. We have to protect ourselves. The police have to protect us. And there is no tolerance for people and their leaders who do not condemn the violence inside Israel. Their big mistake is that because we are in a war of outside the border in Gaza, we can't allow ourselves to be tolerate and to have arrests. It's going to be very dangerous for them, and maybe something like 2,000 will go back. But I can tell you for sure that we have to keep the calm, and we have to protect our citizens, both Arabs and Jews. There is no tolerance for violence in Israel.
All right. Brigadier General Reserves Ram Shmueli, Colonel in Reserves Miri Eisen, thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And while Israel is dealing with real and physical threats on the ground, many accusations and condemnations of Israel amidst praises sung for terror group Hamas coming in from abroad. Chana Rifkin reporting.
Israel's right to defend itself from indiscriminate rocket fire, upheld by several in the international community, leaders in Europe, the UK, and the US, among those calling on Hamas and other Palestinian terror groups to cease their terrorism, while calling on all sides to show restraint and begin reducing tensions.
We stand by Israel's right to defend itself. We also stand by the principle that Palestinians deserve the right to live in safety and security. I'm not here to adjudicate military operations, to say what is proportional precisely, what is not. But the United States certainly stands by the principle that civilians should not, that any loss of civilian life is deeply lamentable, whether that is a Palestinian life or an Israeli life. That is why we've continued to call on calm, call for calm, continued to call on all sides to de-escalate and to exercise restraint in their actions. Yes, Barbara.
While many condemn the loss of any civilian life and called for restraint, however, there are many more denying Israel's right to self-defense, while seemingly supporting Hamas rocket fire and the ongoing riots in Israel. Controversial Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, for one, accusing Israel of terrorism for its airstrikes in Gaza, because Gaza doesn't have an Iron Dome defense system. She fails to even mention Hamas rocket fire against Israel. Likewise, crowds of protesters taking to the streets of New York, London, and elsewhere, particularly in the Arab world, alleging Israel's targeting of children. And so-called squad member Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib calling out the White House for refusing to condemn such killings, but again ignoring Palestinian terror completely. And this despite State Department spokesperson Ned Price expressly lamenting all civilian casualties.
The loss of life of innocent Palestinians, of innocent Israelis, is something we deeply regret, and is precisely why we are doing everything we can. We are doing everything we can in coordination with our international partners to put an end to a cycle of escalation and a cycle of violence.
So what is the overall consensus from the international community, and how will it affect the situation on the ground? With me to discuss, Newsweek columnist and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman, and then author and executive director of Stand With Us Israel, Michael Dixon. Thank you both again for being with us today. Now, Mark, starting with you, you wrote a piece about American Democrats' responses overnight. What do you make of this supposed shift in policy in the Democratic Party?
I don't think it's a shift in policy in the Democratic Party. I think we have a group of people, what's described as the squad, but the very much quote unquote progressives who A, don't know very much, are ignorant, and B, have built in or accepted this, this view. There's this view amongst the progressives these days that it's not important who's right. Whoever's weakest is the right party. Something stuck on me. I saw it this morning. Trevor North gave a monologue last night in the Daily Show about Israel-Palestine. Without going through the whole monologue, the final part of it is, I don't really care about history. Who can tell who's right or wrong? But who's stronger? So whoever's stronger must be the wrong party. People who are stronger should just ignore the weak party. We should totally ignore the attacks from Hamas because they can't hurt us. Well, guess what? They certainly can hurt us. We can't ignore it. And to go back to your first question, I think this time we ignore the international community completely. We do whatever we need to do, whatever we have to do. Keeping in mind, look, ignoring the international community is not to do war crimes and not to do things that we shouldn't be doing. We must continue to do what we have been doing, which is limit civilian casualties to the extent possible. Look at it a different way. I mean, my blood boiled when I saw the New York Times headline this morning that said 20 Palestinians in Gaza killed and 3 Israelis killed because of increased violence or whatever. It should really say only 20 killed, considering the fact that almost all of them were members of Hamas, and considering the fact that we had 500 airstrikes, maybe even more, and only 20 people were killed. That makes it very clear who's being very, very careful to make sure that civilians don't get killed. I mean, we look at World War II or any other war in history, and people didn't care the slightest about civilian casualties. They were part of the game, so to speak. I mean, the United States bombed Japan, bombed Germany. They jumped civilian targets in both those cities as part of the war effort, the full war effort. Hamas has taken the people of Gaza into a war against us. We need to wage that war to the point where we decide we've reached some version of a victory, whatever that means. That's a different discussion. We must be careful. We must kill as few civilians as possible. We must follow the rules of war as much as we can, but we must achieve our goals, because I'm sorry, those rockets that come flying over at us, they do kill people and they do destroy lives. And I don't want to even think about the PTSD it creates to thousands and millions of children who are going to live through these nights and the future nights in the next few weeks. Not to mention those who've been living on the Gaza Strip for the last years.
So Michael, I want to bring you in. What have you noticed, especially as executive director of Stand With Us? It's again, largely suspected that the violence is upending the Biden White House's Middle East policy as well. Is there any truth to this?
I think that we need to make sure that our message is clear about why this is happening now, and why we have people who've been murdered and injured, and why we've had millions of Israelis huddled in their bomb shelters, including people like me and my family. And that's because Hamas has decided to escalate this campaign. Hamas targets civilians, Hamas targets civilians, and Israel targets terrorists. And one of these things is not like the other. And we have to make that very, very clear. There is a reason why this is happening. It's a campaign of terror by an ISIS-like group together with other groups. And I would expect all people of goodwill and world leaders to condemn it as such, as they would in any other country. So it's Hamas who's dictating the violence and the escalation. Israel has to do everything that it can do to safeguard the lives of men, women, and children within its borders. And we need to be telling people that that is the side they should be standing on. And of course, we know, as Mark said, there's a lot of ignorance out there, and our job should be to educate people about the facts of the situation.
All right, Michael Dixon of Stand With Us and Mark Schulman of Newsweek and HistoryCentral.com. Thank you both so much.
Pleasure.
That's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.28 shekels to the American dollar and 2.72 shekels to the Canadian dollar. Finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Telegram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be safe. Thank you so much for watching.